It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting through my website, emailrevealer.com, or you can just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. I am so excited about our guest today, Tiller Russell. This guy is an incredible director. He's one of these guys that when I start looking into him, and I find out that I'm a big fan of like everything this guy's done. Okay, you can find him at tillermanfilms.com. And if you go on Netflix right now, this is why we have him on the show, Waco, American Apocalypse. Mr. Tiller Russell, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you so much for having me.
No, man, thank you so much. I rarely say this to a guest, but I'm a big fan, man. Okay, I'm a big fan of your stuff.
I appreciate you saying that very much. I guess we're swimming in the same waters, you and I.
100%, yeah. Now, before we get into Waco, American Apocalypse, which is right now on Netflix, tell us about yourself. Who is Tiller Russell?
I'm a filmmaker. I grew up in Texas and ended up out in Los Angeles at a certain point. Met Errol Morris at a kind of young and critical age. I was a crime reporter for the newspaper and met him, and he kind of nudged me toward what ended up being my future, although I didn't realize it at the time, and for him it was probably just another crazy night on the tour, so to speak. But after crossing paths with him, decided to move to L.A. and start my filmmaking career, and have been doing largely a lot of crime stories over the years, but in branching out to a bunch of different genres too.
Gotcha. Let's back up a little bit, man. Like a 7-5 with Mike Dowd. How'd you stumble across that story? What caused you to be interested in that?
You know, I am close with Michael Dowd to this day. When you meet all these people kind of coming through, making these things, you end up getting this like weird, colorful, additional family of like maniacs and fascinating characters of all stripes, you know? And so Michael Dowd joined to the circus that has, kind of merry-go-rounded around me ever since. A producer came to me and had footage of Michael Dowd testifying before the Mullen Commission, which was this commission that was basically put it together after he was busted, and what the city of New York wanted to find out. It was the biggest police corruption scandal since Serpico, actually. So the city wanted to find out was what happened with Michael Dowd, an isolated incident of police corruption on NYPD, or was this a citywide epidemic? And so they began this investigation, and Dowd ended up testifying in those publicly televised hearings. So a producer friend of mine had access to those hearings and said, take a look at this. This is pretty incredible. And there were all these amazing, colorful, fascinating, crooked cops that had, been uncovered over the course of it. And among them was Michael Dowd. And so when I had started out, so I talked to that producer. He said, you think there's a movie here? Go sniff around, see what you can find out. I went to New York and initially started actually making kind of a whole different movie, which was about the commission and, meeting all of the different people that had been investigating police corruption in New York City. And that was a fascinating movie in its own right. But the whole time I had been trying to find Michael Dowd and his crew. And the weird thing with Dowd was when he went to the joint was kind of right about the time that the digital revolution, kind of began, right? So when I went to find the other folks that were, on his crew or some of these other, corrupt cops that had been found out essentially in the Mullen Commission investigation, most of those people were findable by using, the bounty hunter software of kind of matrices of known associates and addresses and criminal record and all that kind of stuff. But I couldn't find Dowd anywhere. And I spent months looking for him, sent FedExes all over the country to all these people. And whenever I would get somebody, the first question they would ask me is, did Mikey bless this? And I could not find out. And finally, there was one phone number that was associated with Dowd, and I just on a lark called the phone number, and I was like, lady answered the phone, and I was like, yo, is Mikey there? And she's like, yeah, let me put him on. So she puts Dowd on the phone, and Dowd gets on all fast talking, like, oh, who's this? What do you got? What do you got for me? And I tell him who I am and what I'm doing, and he tells me, I want you to meet me on Long Island tomorrow. So I go and jump on a plane, fly out, get on the LIE, and he like changes the destination a couple of times, and then eventually I hop in the car with him, and I meet this guy, and he's just so fascinating, colorful, insane, unabashed, like, I felt like, man, if you handed this guy like a gun and told him there was a bank over there that he could hit, that he'd hit it right that minute. And so it was this like crazy odyssey that began. But once I saw how unique and fascinating and singular Dowd was, I was like, forget that other movie we were making, called my producer, and I was like, this is the movie. Nobody's ever been like really embedded with a crew of kind of corrupt cops and hear what it's like to bang a line off the dashboard or whatever it is. And so I thought this is going to be a hell of a ride. And so once I hooked up with Dowd, that movie began to take shape.
Yeah, he's in Clearwater now, like not too far from me, and like larger than life, and still out there,
I mean, unchecked, unabashed, and just like wild as ever. He's a truly fascinating, one of a kind character.
Yeah, and I tell you, back when that was going on, I was in Staten Island. I owned a nightclub in Manhattan, and I was out there doing stuff myself. And we knew about the 75 Precinct and the crew over there. These guys were well known as being.
It was legendary, right?
Yeah,
it was legendary. Yeah,
these guys are out there doing stuff. Now, real quick, Operation Odessa. Drug smugglers, they're con men that are trying to sell a Soviet submarine. This is a true story. A Soviet submarine to a drug cartel, right?
This was another crazy one. There's this Russian gangster named Tarzan who used to run his kind of criminal network out of a strip club called Porky's, named after his favorite movie. And he hooks up with a local Miami businessman and a guy that's a Cuban spy, essentially. And these guys put together a plan to sell a submarine to the Colombian drug cartels. And it again, just one of these like wild, larger than life stories. And I had gotten hip to that story. And at the time, Tarzan was locked up in a Panamanian prison. And I think a DEA guy I knew gave me a phone number for him because he had like a BlackBerry inside the prison. And so I literally like picked up the phone and dialed this number, and all of a sudden this voice answers like, "Hello, this is Tarzan. How can I help you?" And I'm like, I can't believe this dude is like in a Panamanian prison answering the phone. And he tells me, well, if you come down here and smuggle yourself into this prison, then, I'll tell you the story of the submarine. So I flew to Panama, smuggled myself into this prison, and began kind of, courting that crazy adventure. So, and then, that ended up taking me all over the world, chasing that story and putting it together. So that was a caper too.
Yeah. I interviewed a guy who was in a Panamanian prison, Billy Prophet. He's like a religious guy now. But he talks about them having AK-47s in there. Okay, the inmates have their own AK.
Dude, I've been in prisons like all across America and and around the world, and I have never seen anything quite like this Panamanian prison. I mean, basically, it was like Mad Max beyond Thunderdome in there. And like when I first walked in, they had all the inmates had cell phones, right? So they're like calling, and so they jam the cell phone towers. So the prisoners start rioting. There's tear gas fired, and I was just like, my God, I have never seen anything like this before. I can't believe this is happening. So there's a sequel in there somewhere with Tarzan that maybe one day I'll tell.
Ooh. Oh, looking forward to that. A question I have about those guys in Operation Odessa is, here it is all these years later on. And now, were they out there still doing stuff, still making money, still out there, or were they all?
It's impossible to know, and I'm not going to be the one to conjecture because several of those guys are very serious guys. Yeah. But it's like once you are kind of in the life, you end up spending a lot of time in that life. So I don't know the details of what they were doing, and I was very deliberately telling one specific story. But all of those guys were truly larger than life characters.
Yeah, I can't recommend that enough. I think I've watched that several times. Silk Road. I've had the mother on. This poor kid got over his head. In my opinion, I didn't watch a film Silk Road, but what was your interpretation of that whole situation?
It's like, on the one hand, I understand that the government felt sort of threatened by this. It's kind of like a revolution in the drug game, right? Where it's no longer just buy busts in the streets and the old-fashioned kind of like cop tactics, that used to work. Suddenly it becomes totally revolutionized when it's on the dark web and everything's being done anonymously with Bitcoin and via Tor. And, here's this young guy who's, by all accounts, a brilliant guy, but, again, sort of falls into that trap of, making money and making a statement, and it becomes this, the biggest dope bazaar in the world, essentially online. So I think by the time that he ended up getting busted, he got an incredibly harsh sentence, in my opinion, like way too harsh. I mean, he got, I think, double life plus 40 without the possibility of parole, which is, even much more draconian than what, somebody like El Chapo got. And I understand that there was kind of an existential threat to the government and to the sort of war on drugs by what he's doing. But I also think they threw away the book on this guy. And I think it's a tragedy because he was very young. And of course, there were all sorts of lives that were affected and people that died. And I'm not defending any of that. But I also believe in second chances and the ability to start a new life. And I wish that he would have the chance to do that.
Yeah, he could be the next Michael Dowd. Now, let me ask you a question. Did you get into the whole situation in that story? 'Cause I didn't watch that one yet. I'm definitely going to. About the DEA agent that was shaking people down and showing pictures of his badge.
Yeah, in fact, there's a fantastic actor that plays him in the movie. This guy Jason Clarke, who's on the the Lakers show on HBO, Winning Time, and he plays kind of a composite version of that character. But I think it's a really terrific, brilliant performance that Jason Clarke gives, and so it's kind of a two-hander. It's the story of Ross Ulbricht, the guy who creates the Silk Road, and this cop, this crooked DEA agent who ends up being instrumental in kind of bringing him down and also ripping him off and setting him up in some ways. So check that one out when you get a chance.
Excellent. And did that cop do any time?
He did. I think he ended up doing, I forget the details of it, but he ended up doing a stretch, maybe 7 years, something like that. I think he may be out now. So, maybe if he wants to sit down, maybe there's a documentary there too.
Another great classic, Night Stalker, Hunt for a Serial Killer. I had Detective Carrillo on the show.
Yeah, Gil is a fantastic, wonderful, wonderful man and wonderful character. And for me, it was a nice change of pace. I had spent a lot of time doing these, for lack of a better word, gangster stories. And suddenly with Gil Carrillo, I found this incredibly bright, incredibly likable, very real cop, homicide cop for the sheriff's department. And he had, in the Night Stalker investigation, he had ended up, really working the case of a lifetime. And he was this, young kind of rookie cop at the time coming up, just joined Sheriff's Homicide, partnered with this legendary, older cop, Frank Salerno, who had been involved in the Hillside Strangler murders. And solved that case. And so it was the pairing of these two guys going after Richard Ramirez in that long, hot summer in 1985, and kind of everybody whose lives were affected by it. And so that was that was very intense and kind of emotional in its own way, and also really scary. I remember driving around in a car in the middle of the night, following the path that Ramirez had gone, and driving by all the houses that he had, hit on his way. And it was spooky in the middle of the night, making that tour and kind of retreading his footsteps, so to speak.
Yeah, they even talk in that film about feeling evil in the room, when they were in there with Ramirez. And I know people that talked to him from prison, and he would describe her kitchen from prison over the phone. Okay.
And it's like, and it's one thing to scare a civilian, to scare somebody that's, it's another thing when you're sitting in there with like hard-bitten murder cops who've seen like the worst of what humanity can do to another, and when it sends a chill down those guys' spines, you're talking about someone genuinely terrifying.
And now a lot of parallels between that series and Waco: American Apocalypse, because you cover a lot of interagency conflicts, a lot of cops dropping the ball. Waco: American Apocalypse, that was like 40 years ago, right?
30, yes. This is the 30th anniversary as of February 28th, and then the fire was on April 19th. So we're right in the middle of it.
Gotcha. So for the kids out there that didn't, I'm 60 years old, so I lived through this. I watched it on TV. But for the kids out there, tell what happened at Waco.
Here's the story in its simplest. There was this religious group outside Waco, Texas, called the Branch Davidians, and it had this leader named David Koresh, who was this charismatic kind of preacher who was preaching that the end of the world was coming and that he and his people were going to engage in a battle with the powers that be, with the federal government, and lead everybody on to the hereafter. And so Koresh and his followers began amassing this arsenal of weapons, converting semi-automatics to automatics, literally sending hand grenades in the mail. And once the local sheriff got wind of what was going on, he contacted the feds, contacted the ATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is the law enforcement agency that handles, mostly gun-related cases. And so the ATF decided that they were going to storm in and do this tactical raid at dawn. The intention was we'll have the element of surprise on our side. We'll kick down the door. We'll arrest David Koresh, confiscate the weapons, and, that'll be the end of it. And instead, what happens is the Branch Davidians get tipped off that the feds are coming. And so they get gunned up, and what erupts is the largest gunfight on American soil since the Civil War. And after this gunfight, in which essentially the Branch Davidians, outshoot and overmatch the feds, this 51-day standoff begins. The FBI comes in to take over for the ATF, and this protracted negotiation is happening where David Koresh and his followers are holed up in their compound. There's a number of kids that are inside it, and the FBI is trying to figure out how to get people out. And in the end, 51 days later, there's this, in fact, very apocalyptic fire, and the people that are still left inside there burn to death, and it all happens essentially on national television. It was the biggest news story in the world in 1993 when it jumped off.
Yeah, even Timothy McVeigh was there. It was a huge circus out in front of that joint. Now, at the beginning of Waco: American Apocalypse, it says on the screen, unseen footage, never before seen footage. And I kind of, smirk, I didn't know it was the same guy behind all these other stuff like Odessa, Operation Odessa and 75. So I'm kind of like, okay, sure. Because, I've interviewed Clive and Doyle. I've interviewed David Thibodeau. Spent 2 hours on the phone with Clive and Doyle. One of the most emotional shows I've ever done. I'm sure. It's a deeply emotional story. And your version is incredibly emotional, okay? It's a whole new groundbreaking of emotion. But you have a lot of exclusive footage on there. And at the very beginning, like the cops had brought in their own news people to cover and video for them. And then it shows them when they're retreating, they're kind of intimidating those reporters. Well, what do you make of that?
Well, here's what it is. Basically, the local TV news gets wind of the fact there's going to be this raid happening, right? So they're not they get tipped off to it. And so the TV news crew is rolling up when the ATF is rolling up. Now, the ATF doesn't, call to them and say, hey, come cover this. They're just there at the same time, but they don't kick them out. I assume the assumption, and I don't know this for certain, but my guess is the assumption is we're going to go in there and kind of kick ass. This will be a great great publicity. This will be great publicity for the ATF as we do this raid with this, powerhouse tactical team. And, it'll all be caught on the news. But what they didn't know was that the Davidians had been tipped off prior to their arrival. So this camera crew is literally caught in a gunfight that's, hours and hours in duration and countless rounds that have gone off. And they're filming the entire time. And then they're filming in the aftermath of it, right? Even walking out, because they know they've shot these tapes that are this is history happening, right before their very eyes and for their cameras. And they know this, just small town news crew knows this is going to be one hell of a story. And so they end up having to kind of walk the gauntlet through the ATF. And by this point, unexpectedly, the ATF has, lost 4 agents and seen all these people, incredibly shot up and are shell-shocked and hurt and bleeding out and losing friends. And yet the camera crew continues to roll. And, much of this footage the world had seen because all this happens in real time and, gets beamed to the nightly news and becomes the biggest story in the world. But kind of miraculously, that local TV news station had kept every single tape from the beginning shootout all the way through 51 days later, the station KWTX in Waco, Texas. And they had perfectly preserved all this stuff, and they were gracious enough to allow me to go into it and to take all those camera original dailies, which ended up being this very new, because you just think of like what you see on the nightly news, maybe it's a 3-minute news clip or a 1-minute news clip, but there's all sorts of footage around it that doesn't make it into the news, but that is sitting there. So for me as a filmmaker, obviously it's a terrible tragedy, and I'm not making and I take that very, very deeply and very seriously. But it was also a gift to have this footage because it was an opportunity to retell the story in a very, intense, propulsive, dynamic, white-knuckle thriller kind of way.
Oh, absolutely. In Waco, American Apocalypse on Netflix right now. You can turn on to Netflix right now and start watching this. And you'll watch it in one sitting. Trust me. The shootout footage is more than I've ever seen before, and I'm into this kind of stuff. I talk to these people. I know these people. This is your beat. This is your beat, after all. Yeah, man. And I was really emotionally taken aback the personal experiences there, but also the extensive news footage. Now, this kind of portrays, and never before in other portrayals of this story have they focused so much on the conflict between the different agencies and that kind of thing. What do you make of all that?
Well, like my approach to this, I was actually very hesitant to tackle this story because it's a big, iconic, American story that everybody knows the word Waco. Everybody knows the name David Koresh. If you were alive at the time, it's burned into your memory. If you weren't alive and you're, 20 years old and you've still heard the name and heard the place. And so I was hesitant to tackle it because I wanted to make sure there was something new and powerful to be done. So there was this, the new news footage that had been done, and then the FBI had also filmed what was happening inside the hostage negotiation room. And I think their assumption at the time was FBI is going to blow in. We're going to take care of this within a day or two. Everybody's going to get out safe and we'll be heroes and we'll save this footage and we'll use it at Quantico to teach the next crew, next crop of agents, how to contend with a standoff situation like this. Well, instead, the story goes a completely different way. And that footage ends up getting, thrown into a box, hidden away. Nobody's seen it for 30 years. And again, my producers in this case find this footage, and to me it was like, we have this image in our mind of what a hostage negotiation is. You think of the Sam Jackson movie where it's one man on the phone talking to, and that wasn't at all what it was like. It was this very complicated team of people, and they're, dealing in real time, passing each other Post-it notes back and forth, what to say. And you can see them, very well-intentioned, trying to get everybody out alive. That's the goal, no matter what. But it's also, there's a big degree of manipulation that has to happen when you're trying trying to talk somebody, particularly with intense religious convictions, out. And so I thought the mechanics of that, hostage negotiation, the crisis negotiation unit, being able to see that in real time just felt so original and vivid and kind of never before seen. So that drew me in too. But like you were saying to begin with, is really for me, it was the people. And it's the people on all sides of this. And I don't say both sides because I think there's more than two. There's the Branch Davidians, and each one is a human being with their own story and their own, complex personal history and, mothers and fathers and, the people that love them. And then same thing for the ATF. These guys, this is some mother's son that's, getting shot up out there. And then the same thing for the FBI too, right? Like every one of these people was, just a person like you and I in this incredibly intense, unprecedented, explosive, volatile situation. And everyone was trying to figure out what the hell to do because the world had never seen anything like this. And so I felt like it was really important to not take a side, to not be pro-Davidian or pro-law enforcement, but to let everybody have the chance to say their true human experiences. And so I tried to be, and my team tried to be, as fair and balanced and respectful, really, of every person involved, so that you, instead of seeing it as a political story, I mean, you could see this as, it's a bunch of religious nuts in Texas, or, it's the knuckle-dragging federal government that's overstepping, and, or you can look at everybody as a human being who has a story. And so to me, that was the approach that seemed real and authentic and, in a weird way, new, because the story has been so politicized and so kind of weaponized over the years that nobody, at least that I knew of, had really just tried to treat everybody like a human being. So that's what I tried to do.
Right, and there have been so many one-sided YouTube videos that everyone's seen. I was surprised when I interviewed Clive Doyle and David Thibodeau that and when I brought up the whole issue of Koresh with young children, they didn't deny it at all. I was shocked. I thought, oh, no way. No. But no, they were so isolated in that compound, in their faith, that they just accepted it and considered it normal.
It's it's one of the very shocking, provocative things about this, right? I mean, this is a story about God and guns in America and how they affect children. And in this case, David Koresh was having sex with not only all the wives of all the members of it after he dissolved the marriages of all of his followers, but then he was having sex with, underage girls and bringing forth, all of these kids that, he thought, would hold a sacred place in his coming kingdom. And it is pretty astonishing to hear that was happening under people's eyes and that it seemed okay because it was cloaked in the language of a prophet telling the truth about God.
And it just goes to show you what isolation will do to isolation from the outside world. Just people get in their own little tribe and they think things are normal. They make their own rules,
Well, and you have to remember, right, all of these people that are there have literally left their all of their belongings behind, left so oftentimes severed ties with their families, maybe traveled halfway around the world. So they're completely in the kind of it is totally isolated, and no one from outside that community is entering into it. So it has its own, it's this crazy bubble where the conventions of the outside world don't really penetrate. And I think, unfortunately, you see this kind of thing a lot in, quote-unquote, cult groups over the years, where you've got a powerful leader at the beginning, you've got people that are hanging on his every word, and other people that are, have entrusted their lives to him. And so it's a powder keg of a story.
I know you took an even stance on this, but what do you make of who fired the first shots, especially when people, they've examined those front doors. There were congressional hearings, and it appears that there was gunfire going in those doors before there was going out.
Well, it's a really challenging question to answer because at the end of the day, and this is just an important kind of fact that I want to add, which is if you look at a door that has bullets in it, that doesn't tell you anything about the time of the entry of the bullet. So like that that argument in and of itself, I think it doesn't hold water because it doesn't tell you the time of impact of the bullet. And when you interview people from both sides or talk to people from both sides, they have completely conflicting accounts because, in a moment like that, you're caught in the fog of war. It's the most intense moment of your life, whether you're one of the cops or whether you're one of the Davidians. Like this is not a day you're ever going to forget. But at the same time, it's so intense and so overwhelming, and all you know is like what you are seeing and experiencing. So I think maybe it's one of those questions that we'll never have the perfectly satisfactory answer to, and everybody's going to have a conflicting account about that. And at the end of the day, I think that's less of an issue than how did we end up in this mess to begin with. Really.
That's so true. As a criminal defense investigator, I'll be interviewing two defense witnesses separately that were in the same room at the same time. Completely different stories. People see things from their own perspective, and they will swear on a Bible. They will swear, no, the way I saw it is 100% right, and the other person the same way I saw it was 100% right. And they're both defense witnesses. Just incredible.
Well, eyewitnesses' accounts are always like shockingly unreliable. They've done those experiments where you take a room full of people in a classroom and two teachers up there, giving the lesson of the day or whatever. Somebody comes in, kicks open the door, has a gun in their hand, fires a shot, runs back out the door. And you go around the room and you interview people, and like one will be like 6'4", redhead. Somebody's like, no, it's 5'9", like, flat-nosed dude. Like they're so wildly divergent. It's a funny thing about eyewitness testimony, how unreliable it is, which is, and I'm not sure exactly why that is, but it's a universal phenomenon.
Oh, yeah, I've done it myself. I'll swear to God this is what happened, and then I'll find out later on I'm wrong. Yeah. Okay? But there was no footage, there was no video footage that maybe got, destroyed, from where the first shot took place?
Of the exact moment that it happens, no, I don't think there is. I mean, if there is, I'd love to have it because I'll put it in the revised version of it. You know what I mean? When it's all said and done. But like at the end of the day, that's kind of the job, right? Is you sift through everything you can find. You uncover, every document, every recording, every photograph, and then you have this like, you've spread out with this mass of all this material, and then you take all of these conflicting and colliding accounts, right? And then you try to stitch all this together in a way that feels like it's as close to the truth as you can possibly get. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there. I didn't live through this. I wasn't in Waco. I'm reconstructing it after the fact. And so I'm working from the available archival material and the accounts and trying to weave it together and really look at it very clinically and very critically, what happened, and then also in human terms, most importantly, I would say in human terms, what does it feel like? This is like it's an examination of the human experience. What's it like to live through something like this, or to die, or to watch somebody you love die in an unprecedented historical event.
Yeah, once again, we're talking to Tiller Russell. TillermanFilms.com. We're talking about Waco, American Apocalypse, which is available on Netflix right now. But check out this guy on IMDb. He was an associate producer on that film Bernie, which is like that incredible story. It's like all great stuff, man. Just all great stuff that I've always enjoyed over the years. But back to Waco, American Apocalypse. There are still people that live in that town that are still followers of that faith. Did you get a chance to talk to any of them?
Yeah, there absolutely are, and it's interesting. I think that it's I mean, and one of the things that people forget is the Branch Davidians were there long before David Koresh. I mean, they were there as early as the 30s. You know, it's an offshoot from the Seventh-day Adventist, and really had been, you know, in Texas and sort of developing their theology long before David Koresh. And I guess in some ways it's no surprise that it has continued afterwards. He just ended up being, you know, the defining figure that makes all of us know the words, you know, Branch Davidians.
Now, you featured a fellow, I apologize, I don't know his name off the top of my head, but he had a goatee, and he was one of the snipers that came in with the sniper team. And
yeah, Chris Whitcomb from the FBI's hostage rescue team.
There you go. Very colorful character again, and kind of mugging it up for the camera, okay? A little bit, right? But, you know, great footage, right? What do you make of his testimony where he claims things like he saw a rifle pointing out of a building, and as the building was on fire, a bullet whizzed by his head? Were you able to confirm any of this independently besides his testimony or his interview?
Well, there were countless shots that were fired as the tear gas was pointing in. That's, right, you know, universally acknowledged. And so, like, unquestionably, the Davidians were shooting on that day. I don't think there's any dispute about that. And this is a guy that you have to understand, like, this is somebody that has spent his entire professional life, you know, as a warrior, as a soldier, you know, before this and then long after it. And this is a guy that's seen a lot of action. And the interesting thing about Chris Whitcomb is this is not like, you know, you might think that, okay, this is just going to be some, you know, thug or whatever, but I actually found him to be one of the brightest people I've ever been in a room with. You know, he was also a poet, and he was a songwriter, and he had deeply engaged with David Koresh's theology over the course of those 51 days. And, like, his job as a sniper is literally sitting there for hours at a time, looking through, you know, a scope and studying a small sector of the building and watching the minute movements of the people, who shows up at the window, when is, you know, what weapons, you know, eventually appear. And he wrote a book about it shortly after it happened. And, you know, it's a chapter in a book of the many wild adventures he's had doing what he does. And so he had very precise notes that he had taken literally at the time on a daily basis. And he was also in charge of the photography unit for the hostage rescue team. So he actually had, you know, hundreds and hundreds of photographs that the snipers had taken during their time there, which were featured in the series. I guess the long-winded answer to your question is it's impossible to independently corroborate every single thing that somebody says, but that guy seemed to me as bone honest, serious of a person as I've ever met, and I take him at his word at everything he said.
You know, I'm happy that you had a chance to really flesh this out, about the poetry and all this stuff, because watching the film, I tell you, man, I had a hinky feeling about this fellow watching the film. So I'm glad you had an opportunity here to flesh it out.
Yeah, I really found him to be a particularly fascinating character and human being, and a very serious, and actually a very serious guy.
Now Clive Doyle, he passed away, or he chose not to cooperate?
He passed away, yeah, actually during the course of doing it. And you know, there's also this, you know, it's always and I obviously know of him and sort of, you know, the legend and lore of him, so to speak, and his reputation. And it's also a fine line, right? Because at a certain point, you've got 3 hours of screen time that you're going to take up. And, you know, I wanted to have a variety of different perspectives and accounts, you know. So I wanted to have the youngest child who got out alive, a woman by the name of Heather Jones. She was 9 years old at the time. And David Thibodeau, you know, as you know well, who's playing in Koresh's rock and roll band. And then Kathy Schroeder, who was one of David Koresh's spiritual wives. So, you know, when you're trying to put together a portrait of somebody who's no longer there to speak for themselves, which I mean, in some sense, I'm talking about Koresh. I mean, directly, I'm talking about Koresh. I wanted to get different vantage points on him as a human being. The vantage point of a child, the vantage point of a woman that had been in a relationship with him, the vantage point of, the drummer in the band. And you can never include all the perspectives, but it felt like, and then you want it to be balanced. You want a certain number of people from each of these groups so that it doesn't feel like it's favoring one side or the other. So I did the best I could to make it as even-handed as I could.
Yeah, I think it could have gone way more than 3 hours. And just the 9-year-old, she's an adult woman now, but just the accounting of this 9-year-old alone, you can do a whole 3 hours on that. Now, I watched it a few days ago, but she actually shot somebody at the end, right?
You're talking about Heather Jones? Is that what you're talking about, the young woman?
Yeah, the 9-year-old, but she's grown up. But when she was 9, she actually shot somebody there at the scene?
No, she ended up seeing someone shot, basically. One of Koresh, like when the gunfight jumps off with the ATF, and bullets are ripping through, she's hunkered down on the ground, just trying to protect the other young girl that she's in a room with, and she sees, right in front of her, one of Koresh's spiritual wives get shot, and so was right there, and then it was her uncle, her grandfather who ended up shot in the shootout, and that the Davidians ended up subsequently putting out of his misery, and so she witnessed so much of that firsthand as a young child, and it was just seared into her memory. So I felt like that interview with her was one of the most powerful things I've ever been in a to do.
No, I agree. And how is she doing today? How is she coped with this as an adult? Does she have family, kids?
Remarkably tough and resilient, and I don't want to say too much about her personal life, because at the end of the day, that's up to her, whatever she would want to share or not share, and I would want to respect her privacy. But I found her to be, that is the kind of thing that could destroy you and prevent you from ever having a whole and full life. And instead, I found her, very tough and resilient, and also very open and vulnerable about what had happened to her. And I thought it was incredibly brave of her to come forward and tell her story.
Yeah, and how about her and the spiritual wife? I know Thibodeau still has sort of the same faith. I think he still is on board. But what about their faith? Did they take off a different direction or what?
I think everybody is actually conflicted, and I would put Thibodeau in that category. It depends on what day you sort of catch him on, and sort of what his, who he expresses what to. But I think, all of these people were very conflicted about it. Nobody had completely shunned it and turned their backs on it and said this was a fraud, this was a con, this was a lie. And at the same time, they saw what happened and the tragedy that ensued. So I think they also were, emotionally torn apart by that, as you would be. And so I don't think there's any easy answers to any aspect of the story. I think it's like, in some ways, it's almost like a ghost story that haunts us as a culture, and certainly haunts all the people that lived through it.
Yeah, Waco, American Apocalypse on Netflix right now. Yeah, I actually had Ramona Africa, too, on the show from Move, that was burned alive down there in Philly, too. So, we get them all over here, But now,
yeah, you and I are definitely doing the same, in the same field of work, looking at these stories and looking at these people and trying to engage with and understand it in a way that's, hopefully without judgment, that's just an exploration.
Yeah, I want to take a statement. Okay, what is your statement? Let me just jot down the facts, and the audience can decide later on. One of the biggest issues, though, at Waco is, how did the fire start? Now, I've watched these YouTube videos, like I said, and they're very detailed, and the flashes, blah, 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 blah. Well, you didn't include any of that. Did you come to a conclusion yourself? Did Tiller Russell himself come to a conclusion as how the fire started?
Well, at the end of the day, like I said, it's not like I wasn't there, so I'm never going to sort of say categorically, anything about any of this, because I'm reconstructing it from a secondhand basis, and I'm acutely aware that it's a secondhand basis. But if you look at the FLIR footage that was shot at the time in terms of multiple fires breaking out simultaneously, if you listen to those audio bug tapes about pour more fuel on the ground, which are included in the series, And the conclusion of, the multiple congressional investigations, and if you talk to any of the, the majority of the independent reporters that are covering the story, they will say to you categorically the Davidians started the fire, world without end. I am not going to make a sort of definitive statement about it one way or another. You talk to David Thibodeau and he says, I never saw anybody starting fires. I don't believe that. And I included him saying that because that was his experience of it. And like I said, all you can do is reconstruct it from the material that's there. And so I feel like it's actually important to include the conflicting accounts and to let people continue to sort of argue the point as opposed to trying to draw a line in the sand in a conclusion when it's not something you lived through.
As far as Waco American Apocalypse, is there anything about this documentary series that I haven't asked you that you want the audience to know?
I guess the last thing, to sort of share is that for me, one of the exciting things, and again, I use exciting cautiously because I treat this very, very seriously. But from a filmmaking perspective, is we use this very cutting edge, 3D technology to reconstruct the compound in, very meticulously, journalistically accurate fashion. And then it's using this sort of dynamic cutting edge 3D technology to rebuild it in a way that it enables you to experience it from a different perspective. All of the footage that was shot at the time was in news cameras for the most part, way far back behind the press lines. And so it felt important to me to figure out how to bring it to life. And I worked with this amazing 3D graphics company out of France called Myth Factory. And I think that the work that they did was really pretty revolutionary and sort of startling. And so I was grateful to have the chance to collaborate with them and to bring some new filmmaking to the table.
And if you had another hour to fill, is there anything you would want to expand on as far as your film, Waco American Apocalypse?
There's all sorts of amazing stories that end up getting, that fall to the wayside and end up on the cutting room floor. And we actually ended up doing an associated podcast series, which we released a 4-episode series of as well, if anyone's interested in checking that out. Yeah, it's the Waco American Apocalypse podcast, companion series. And that goes into some of the other things, the legacy and its impact and the connections to Oklahoma City and additional stories, about Koresh and the story of the undercover ATF agent. So there's, when you tackle a story like this, there's so many amazing details that you end up having to sacrifice. But I did, the very best I could to make it as hopefully complete and as satisfying as it could be within the 3-hour limits of the format.
Oh, no, like I said, Waco American Apocalypse has a whole new emotional depth to it. There's footage you've never seen before. And again, very, very, very compelling. And your body of work is just incredible. I'm going to ask you some questions about American Manhunt, the Boston Marathon bombing. But you know what I like, right? You know what I'm into. What other films should
I know you? I know your beat. I got a beat on you.
So then, what else should I be looking for of your work? Tell me what I should look for to go back and find something.
There's another series which you should check out called The Last Narc, which was on Amazon, which was about this notorious murder that happened actually the same year that the Night Stalker happened, murder of the DEA agent Kiki Camarena in Mexico in 1985. And that's a 4-part series that I did for Amazon, which is pretty, I think a pretty intense series as well. So take a look at that. If you haven't seen Silk Road, I think that's on Hulu right now. And then the Boston Marathon, American Manhunt, the Boston Marathon bombing debuts next week on the 12th. So, give that a peek and see if that captures your imagination. I was the creator and executive producer of it, but hired this brilliant filmmaker named Floyd Russ to come in and direct that one. So hopefully beginning to expand the portfolio, not just the stuff that I'm directing, but also producing for other great filmmakers to tell, these what I hope are important stories.